Double Neck Download is streaming live to our YouTube channel. I'm
That's
Richard
right.
Hunter. That is Hal
Hal
Sparks
Sparks. Yeah.
winning the green screen contest for
Green,
today.
green screen, excuse me. This is a full-size painting I had commissioned. I was, everybody's learning their quarantine skill, and I've been working on my photorealistic painting.
Yeah.
So I was really inspired by the movie Xanadu,
Mm.
and the fact that the main character, played by the guy from The Warriors, I forget his name right now, who was an album painter. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
That was his job. He took regular album covers and he
Mm-hmm.
painted them on giant billboards.
Yeah.
He was a yeah. He saw a girl on the beach and it was roller skating Olivia Newton-John, and she was suddenly on an album cover and nobody could figure out where she came from, and they tried to write her a check as a model and they couldn't track her down, and then he tracks her down and she's dancing with Gene Kelly in an abandoned club on PCH.
That is a
You know,
much better. That is a much better recall of the film
oh,
than I have.
dude, I love that movie. I
Yeah.
mean, because it came out right as the time I had a huge crush on Olivia Newton-John, like
Mm-hmm.
a big dumb crush,
Mm.
and a kid crush,
Yeah.
and the album, interestingly enough, and I don't know how many people remember, but the record was half Olivia Newton-John, half ELO.
Mm.
So the front, if you bought the LP of Xanadu, which I did,
Mm-hmm.
the A side is Olivia Newton-John, or no, the A side is ELO, and the B side is Olivia Newton-John songs.
That's
So
interesting. I
all
didn't
the
know
songs,
any. Yeah.
yeah. So there's a bunch of songs that like "I'm Alive" and all those kind of things. The ELO tunes that came from it, they were just on one side of the record, and they weren't intermingled like they were in the record. They didn't go. That was clearly some sort of contract negotiation at the barrel of a gun,
Right.
and I don't know who won or who lost in this argument, but yeah,
That's like a. It's like the concept of doing a split single, but a split album with a
totally,
band.
yeah, dude, it was
Interesting.
like, yeah, it was A side, B side, 45, just 33 speed, and the full record.
Yeah.
But in many ways, because it was probably when I was 10, maybe 11 years old when that movie came out. It was genuinely my first experience with ELO songs.
Mm-hmm.
Because so people write off a lot of those sort of silly movies like the Sergeant Pepper movie that the Bee Gees did and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But if you're in an age range where you're 8 to 10 years old, that might be the first time you hear that music, and then you go back and you discover it.
Yeah.
In the case of ELO, it's really them that helps.
Well,
But
no, that's true, and it's kind of like that's what I always think of when I see people talking about Kiss's Dynasty album, because I think there's kind of a
yeah,
dynasty movement, because it's like
oh yeah,
for a lot, and I understand, for people who are a little bit older than us, they had already been Kiss fans long enough that Dynasty was a disruption to them. But
right,
for me, even though it wasn't, I mean, I had all the records up to that point before Dynasty came out. That was as I think about it, I think that was my first like new release Kiss album. You know what I mean? Like the
yes,
one that came out and I got that day and all that kind of stuff. And it was
yeah,
my first tour to see. So, there's a whole generation of people who, as soon as somebody starts saying, I'm actually going to use the phrase Kiss purist,
yeah,
start saying, well, wait a second, that was the dawning of the disco era. There's also a whole bunch of people that are very quick to say, well, wait a second. I
yeah,
understand it was a little different, but that was my real time foray. You know what I'm saying? That
right.
was, yeah.
And a lot of times it was, looking back, it's more of a production difference than it was
Mm-hmm.
a style difference. But they had not settled on. I mean, I think for a lot of people, Destroyer was the settled sound finally.
Mm-hmm.
The first three records, there was a lot of Hotter Than Hell and Dressed to Kill and the original album. There was a lot of thinness to those records.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They were sonically very thin,
Mm-hmm.
and so the when Destroyer came along and filled out the sound, and beefed the guitars up, and you had, layering the bass notes with piano keys,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of sonic trickery to give some heft. Then Dynasty sonically felt like a step back because it was pop mixing, much like Crazy Nights is pop mixing compared to Animalize or Asylum
Mm-hmm.
or Lick It Up for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
It's like when you're aiming towards radio from an old radio ear kind of a way, the guitars get thinner, the bass tends to be brought up and washes a little more. The drums have and the drum and vocal, like the snare and the vocal, you can hear when you have the music turned almost all the way down. Those
Mm-hmm.
kind of mixing tricks
Mm-hmm.
that are lost in metal, and how it's mixed a lot of times because there's a homogeny to the sonic mix because you're supposed to grab it all. Uh-oh,
Mm-hmm.
are you in a haunted house now?
No, no, no. I was just
That
getting a little off-camera cue from
Oh,
the
nice.
house producer. You're all good.
Gotcha. I thought it was the opening of God of Thunder,
Yeah.
or the closing, the beginning or the ending of God of Thunder, but which you did with perfect timing, by the way. So yeah, sonically, there's a lot of that is of issue,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why I think Dynasty felt like a dismissal. But if you listen, I remember hearing. I Was Made for Loving You was in many ways, as a 10-year-old, my first Metallica-like riff. First chugging guitar I ever heard in a song was from I Was Made for Loving You.
Yeah. Okay. I could see that. Yeah. Yeah.
And when they
Yeah.
do
Right.
it live, it
Mm-hmm.
sounds incredibly heavy comparatively.
Yeah. If
And those
you.
little, yeah.
Oh no, I was just gonna.
Mm-hmm. You were going to say that you froze. What you were going to say? You're going to say that you're freezing, frozenness.
Okay, hang
Freezing.
on. Are we back? Are we back? Okay,
You're
cool.
back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was to say, if you took out the disco
The
drum
doo-doo-doos.
beat, yeah,
And you give it a harder snare.
yes, it would be exactly what you're describing. It's
Right.
kind of like, I mean, for this, for I don't know if we've discussed my musical background on this show, but so the band spent the most time in was, for most intents and purposes, a bluegrass band, but it had a drummer. And when you had
bluegrass
drums,
band, for those at home you're a little choppy right now, and I think it's because
yeah,
the dog is probably playing Animal Farm or whatever that is. Animal
it,
Crossing.
But we had a drummer, and with drums to bluegrass, it becomes grass.
Yeah.
You're like, this is like, we were able to play rocks with that, because all of a sudden, you've got like a thrash type beat. Yeah. So you're right. It's kind of interesting how the song as a whole, or the production as a whole, or the band as a whole takes the brunt of this. Oh, the entire thing is going in a different direction, when really you can isolate one aspect of it and go subtract this, and it's actually very different than what you're thinking it is.
Right. And I have a very I'm much more forgiving when you make an artistic choice as a band to go, we want this album to sound like this, which is what the case is in the case of Dynasty. It's what the case is in the case of Unmasked, The Elder, Crazy Nights, even Revenge or whatever. Like, they're making distinct choices. The band was making choices about how they wanted to sound. They weren't confused about what they sounded like. They were trying to create what they wanted to hear, the kind of music they wanted to make. Unlike some other artists who think their mix is heavy, and it's really they're messing it up. I would, I'm a big fan of Wasp, that, and Still Not Black Enough is one of my favorite albums from Wasp. But I don't know if he and the engineer, maybe his front of house sound guy, was doing the mixing, but it's one of the tinniest records you'll ever hear. But you can clearly see that they feel like they're under they seem to be believing that it's a heavy sounding record to them. The way the instrumentation is, all that stuff, it's just really tiny sounding compared to what's really there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a mistake. Like, it should be mixed fuller. The guitars are there. You can tell from the mix, the sounds they have to work with that are on tape or in the recording are present and as loud as you would need them to be to mix a really heavy record. But it just sounds like it's bottlenecked through a tweeter. And I find that's more of a mistake than people who go, I want this album to sound like this. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants their album to sound like that. They think their album sounds like something else, and because of their ears are screwed, or something. So I never had a problem with. And that was the thing with Dynasty. But go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to let everybody know that such is the fluidity of the double neck download. We had not intended to start with
let everybody know that.
I'm echoing back. There we go.
Okay,
with a production analysis, but that's what we do here. Never know when that's going to break out.
Yeah, it's always going to roll back to a rating of Kiss albums and how they sonically work out. No question. That said, we were going to talk about, and I think it's important to talk about, the state of live music.
Yes.
In the world of of COVID-19. I've decided, by the way, I've decided I'm going to start a new band called Potential Spam. And
I would get calls from you guys all the time.
That's right. Yeah, we have the best outreach in the world.
Yeah.
And my other side project, Unknown.
Good one.
Potential Spam and the Unknown.
I know someone who had a similar idea about going by the name Many More, because Many More is added to so many bills. Yeah, they'd be very busy.
There was a band in LA called the Post Nobles at one point, and their logo was Post No Bills.
Oh,
when you saw that on construction sites or whatever, they were like, which I never got. Like, I get it if you have artwork up.
Yeah.
If you have like Post No Bills as a sign in front of it, if you have like a picture, this is what the building's gonna look like. But if it's a bunch of plywood, it's kind of cool to have a bunch of band posters and shit up or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to go by there and somebody puts something racist and nasty up, tear it down, spray over it. You know what I mean? But like, bands will do that for you. If you come up and you're putting up band posters and some assholes put up some sort of, sexist, bigot, riotous monstrosity, throw your poster up over it and everybody will love you for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That in and of itself, I always hated, but they were called the Post Nobles.
Yeah. Makes sense.
But so here, and the Post Nobles would be doing great, by the way.
Yeah.
The prevailing situation for live music and in many ways live comedy, any kind of live performance, was slowly on a downward track for the last 5 years. There were some mega tours, and it really did aim at why there were so many This Is the End tours, I think. Is not because bands couldn't continue to roll on like the Rolling Stones, which is, they're always on an end tour because they're like so friggin' old. You figure this might be my last chance no matter when you see them. So everybody does that. Like, they're just going to tour forever. Like, yeah, but they might kick off. Holy shit. They might just puff and turn into dust at some point.
Hey, my suggestion to get around all this criticism about the retirement tours, then you come out of retirement, all that, don't call it that. Just call it the imminent collapse tour. Right. And the only promise is this: look, we're going to keep this thing going for as long as we can. But at this point, something could blow up in the blink of an eye, and you may want to be there because we're not sure if it's going to be the day after we come to your town. Just try to fit all that onto a poster. There's nothing that implies false advertising about that.
I would argue that has a lot to do with the bullshit stories about like artists who are on the edge or falling apart or dying of drug overdoses and all that kind of stuff, when obviously they had the means and wherewithal to sit through a recording process, a mixing process, a track choice meeting, album artwork they signed off on. They managed to do all that, but no, he's going to be dead any day now. 6 years later, any day now, they put out, 3 more albums.
Yeah.
So there's something to like the news about that, being a marketing ploy in a lot of ways to get you to go see him live, to get you off your ass, to buy the record because this might be the last record they make. But this pre-digital download that had a huge effect on things because if they stopped printing them because the band died, Now, I saw Kiss right before they shut, this whole thing down, and the one upside I see for performers and musicians of all sorts is that I don't see people taking live shows for granted the way they used to.
Yeah.
For the last, 5 years, unless this is the last time we're going to see these guys, they're going to quit touring. We might as well get up off our lazy ass, get out of the house and go see something, stop Netflixing and chilling our life away. I keep seeing all these pictures of the year 1920, right after the Spanish flu, and the streets are friggin' packed, and they're having ticker tape parades and Macy's balloons, and all these people are just out in public like nuts. And I feel like that's part of the natural psychological response to it,
Yeah.
But who benefits right away? You had a theory about who's going to benefit, earlier than that, because I think a year from now that'll be the case.
Yeah. No, go ahead. You go ahead.
Oh, it's like the venues that will open first, obviously.
Oh, clubs. Yeah. So my thought is this, and this actually doubles down nicely with a story about Anvil. Everybody loves Anvil. That they're going to stream a live show in July in Quebec City. And they were talking to the Metal Voice about this. Now, you first hear this and you think, okay, well, the return of Anvil in terms of marketing impact is not exactly what's going to become of the Motley Crue, Def Leppard co-headlining tour. And that's true. But, I mean, not only the last time I saw Anvil, the last couple of times, anytime I've ever seen Anvil, really, it's always in a room that can comfortably hold maybe 300 people, and you could jam maybe 4 in there if you had to. But that's if you're a band that's got big stage production and you play a venue that's even the size of like a House of Blues, for example, it's going to still look a little empty. It's going to still look a little sound check-ish, right, when you're playing, to say the least. But if you're a 3-piece band like Anvil without a lot of stage production and pyrotechnics and all that, and you're used to playing small clubs, small stage anyway, you're going to have a shorter distance to transition in terms of when you put your production on. I'm not going to have to adjust nearly as much as I would if I'm seeing Motley Crue in that same kind of scenario. So, silver lining, limited upside to being a band on the level of Anvil. They could be, they could ride a wave of being the first bands back and enjoy the headlines and the press coverage that's going to come with it. Because, it's same thing with any of the other businesses that are reopening. Which ones are going to reopen first? Well, why is a hair salon reopening before a live venue? It's because you're only dealing with a few customers at a time in a small space as opposed to a giant mass gathering. Same principle applies.
Yeah. Well, and also, you're not going to judge half full clubs the way you used to. Instead of going, Jesus, nobody's here. People are going to go, sweet, nobody's here. Like, there's an element of like, if they're doing social distancing, you can go, well, we didn't turn many people out. So, like startup bands and smaller groups are going to have, a sort of a safety margin around them that that bigger bands don't have, or that cut into how much they're expecting to make most nights,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of stuff. So, and venues are going to be so hungry for performers because there'll be a lot of competition for thinner and thinner crowds. Ticket prices will go way through the roof. It'll be like seeing a private show of one of your favorite artists,
Well, that raises another question. So this is going to be one. It'll be a great opportunity. We talked about this before about how, the old excuse for why you're having to play smaller venues is I wanted to get closer to the fans. I wanted to have a more intimate experience. Well, now you can actually adjust it to, hey, we're taking safety into consideration here, which is great. But
get farther away from the fans.
Yeah, and it'll also we've talked before about how this is going to give rise to the residency and things like that. But I think it is going to pose an interesting conundrum for bigger bands. Meaning, if we're a band that already commands $100 ticket, are we going? Let's take the residency. I mean, because you could do this with a residency and make it work. But let's say you're not going to do the residency. Let's say you're somehow going to try to do some semblance of a tour. If you're used to charging an $800 ticket and drawing, maybe upwards of 10,000 people, are you going to be okay with saying, okay, we're going to space people far enough apart that we're only going to be able to draw maybe 20% of our potential? And then if that's the case, are we going to stick to the $100 ticket, or are we going to do something like, charge $500 and, make it like a VIP type thing, but also risk, I could see a real potential backlash there of, being looked at as, oh man, at a time like this, you're doing something like that. I mean, it's not going to be a black and white situation because I'm going to be able to look at that band and go, okay, yeah, but if you want the show they're used to putting on, it takes massive production. I mean, they've got to make that amount of money for a reason to be able to put it on.
It's like Cirque du Soleil tickets for that kind of level. I will say some bands in the mid zone who could come to places like the Roxy in LA or the Fonda Theater, or medium to slightly larger size, like House of Blues size places. There's a couple of things they can do. Instead of moving on in one night, they do 2 nights in a row and shorter sets. So you're basically doing 2 sets like the Beatles used to do when they were woodshedding in Germany. You come in and instead of doing one big 90-minute show, you're doing 2 hours that night with a break in between, and they roll the audience in. And, you know what I mean?
That's interesting.
And so you're splitting the audience between, you can see the A show and the B show, and then the next night you can see the B show and the A show. You know, and if you wanted to go twice, you can. If you can't, you're seeing an hour. It's live. You're seeing pretty much just the hits. You could have an A show with the hits and a B show with the deep tracks, and the real fans can come to B, and the fans from the radio can come to the A show. There's ways to do it if you're Friday and Saturday nighting at someplace like that, and pulling crowd, and then you've got multiple people. You're basically getting that money that you're talking about setting up from fans that decide to see both shows.
So really kind of like what Kiss does on the cruise. They play a couple of shows, you get tickets to one, you choose which one to go to. I think I don't know if you can, in the past, you could upgrade that situation to go to both. I'm sure. Yeah. Sure, you all you had to do was have a quick word with Gene Simmons. Well, speaking of Kiss, former Kiss guitarist Bruce Kulick gave an interview talking about how, Bruce is 66 years old himself. And he was talking about how, this may cause some older musicians to retire earlier than they planned. I mean, in other words, by the time this whole situation gets back up to a level of supporting live music, they might have just kind of aged out of it. And it reminds me of, I kind of dealt with a similar thing in radio when podcasting came along, because in radio for so many years, you had guys who were audio only, so they never had to worry about like what they look like. There was no such thing as websites, Facebook pages. Right. They were anonymous, basically physically anonymous, right? People just recognized their voices. And then when, at first it was MySpace, but when that came along, the dawn of social media, websites came along, and all of a sudden these old radio guys were going, wait a second, what do you mean we have to maintain this whole visual presence? And wait, what is podcasting? What does that involve? Yeah. A lot of those older guys had to make a decision. They had to say, okay, do I want to learn this, or do I want to just go ahead and call it a day? And I fell in this middle category where it was like I was young enough to understand the dawning of it and to embrace it, but I was also old enough to know a day before its existence. I mean, nowadays, people who've only been working in radio maybe 5-10 years, they've never known a world without social media. So I could at least relate to. So I was right there on that edge where I had to go, no, I've got enough decades still left in this business that I need to learn how to do this sort of thing. And I think to Bruce's point, this may be kind of like what a lot of musicians are. Older musicians already had to go back to basics a number of years ago once streaming started with, okay, now we got to be DIY just like the old days. We got to go back to the way that was. And to some degree, it benefited them because younger bands, maybe didn't understand that so well as older bands did. But now they may have to make a similar decision of, okay, are we going to really start devoting all of our energy to figuring out how we can perform at old drive-in theaters or resident, all that sort of thing? Or we're
just perform live, period.
Exactly, because, we were only maybe a year or two away from calling it a day anyway. So maybe now's just the time to do all that. It's going to be I think an interesting dilemma that a lot of musicians of a certain age group are going to have to factor in.
Right. I don't know. I feel there is a little bit of, I will go in contradiction. By the way, if you haven't checked out Bruce Kulick's tweeting of Kiss guitar solos and little pieces of songs that he's showing people how to play, and he's just playing them live and those kind of things, it's really wicked watching him do it. It's so cool. If follow him on Twitter and you'll see all that stuff. I'm of the other mind, and this kind of goes towards the vocal issues that Paul's had in the past, is I was saying this, and you'll recall back when we started this podcast, I was like, what Paul needs is a year off to let his voice heal. And there's tons of people like that. Like they need to, keep warm eventually, but they need a period of time where their vocal cords can just heal. There's a certain amount of just all you can do is rest and not tear them to pieces every other night or every single night, for, that gacks people up over time. That you just need, maybe you need 3 months off, but if you're older, you probably need 6 months off. And then you go back through a vocal training regimen, and you'll find your way back to your voice. You just will. You know what I mean? Tissue heals. But without that break, you'll never get there. And Kiss was doing this final tour and all this stuff, and everybody was talking about Paul's, diminished vocal capacity and all that bullshit. And I love that Paul's diminished vocal capacity is because he's been touring since 1973. And he's competing with people who have never sung live, who are always on tape. Like, give me a break. So he also, and I just want to say, also has one of the biggest, strongest rock voices of all time. Like you've got to factor in how you've got to factor in how much you had to lose to begin with, is what I'm saying. So totally. if you're in a situation right now where you stand there, If you're Bob Dylan, nobody's missing your pithy nuances. And if you're
Yeah.
Neil Young, nobody notices that your notes have wavered as you've aged.
Yeah, yeah, and you know what? I mean, it probably wasn't so much by design back then that hey, I'm 22 now. If I just kind of stay within this more limited range, this is going to be awesome when I'm in my 70s. But it has worked out for him. I mean, it's just kind of like it's the
Ann Wilson from Heart, famously, when she and her sister were writing songs. She has a beautiful voice, but her range is more narrow than people know as far as keys and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So they sat down and she talked about this. I interviewed her. She was the first celebrity interview I ever did when I was on Talk Soup. They had me interview her for this thing. I interviewed Ann and Nancy, and they sat down and had this, like, okay, what chords do we play in where my voice, which is great, sounds best?
Yeah.
What's the best nest we can build for my vocal quality? In Kiss, they never did that. They just, Paul found it later as his voice got better and stronger. But like I said, going back and playing the old songs screwed him up. But I will say there's the point I was overall making was that for all the people who might retire early because of this, there's also people who are going to have a renewed vigor because they had a rest they couldn't afford to take before, but had no choice. And just that as a gift is pretty extraordinary,
Yeah,
So,
it is, and it's like a self-imposed rehab is kind of what you're talking. And it also, this is something that it's tough when it would be one thing if everybody in a 4-piece band was in the same boat in terms of everybody needed to rest their voice. It's really unfair because in these scenarios, it's generally only one person. It's one person who is physically affected, and then everybody else can more or less play guitar, bass, or drums about the way that they have, with few exceptions.
Yeah, unless something bad happens, right?
Right. So, and if you're in a band full of understanding guys, then they get that. But I think the fans and it's actually good that you brought this up, because I also was going to take us to a interview that Chris Jericho had recently given. And he was specifically talking about vocal abilities of Paul Stanley and Vince Neil. He rightly acknowledged Paul Stanley as one of the greatest rock singers of all time. I mean, really echoing the points that we were just making about, when you're that great for so long, it just means that you've got further to fall when you get older. Totally. But I thought he drew an interesting contrast. This interview was with Triple M Radio in Australia, by the way. He was saying that here's this quote.
By the way, Australia, a country known for its dulcet-toned rock singers.
Yeah, right. He said, listen, speaking of singers like Paul Stanley, they're in their late 60s, early 70s, whatever it may be. If they're out there playing and doing the best they can, and there's tricks they can use to make it better if need be, I'm fine with that. This was in response to, the possibility that Paul Stanley had been using some tracks on the later legs of the End of the Road tour. And he brought up, other people like, Paul McCartney, for example, who I just saw live, by the way. Paul McCartney was great. Still just amazing. But, it's great. Yeah. But he compared him to Mick Jagger. And he's like, okay, Mick Jagger sounds more like Mick Jagger has always sounded than Paul McCartney sounds more like Paul McCartney has always sounded.
Right.
But there's a difference in range. Then he talked about Vince Neil. And he was more critical of Vince Neil. And I agreed with him on this point because
Paul sings all the words.
Right. Here's what he said about Vince Neil. He said, quote, "That to me is way worse, but that's always been Vince. I wish Vince would just try a little harder. And I think if this tour happens, meeting the stadium tour, I bet he will. That could be motivation to work on his conditioning a bit and maybe take some vocal lessons. I don't know, maybe on all that. But I will agree with him on, I enjoy going to see Motley Crue. But you got to know what you're getting with Motley Crue. Right. Which is Vince Neil. It's not a technically polished performance in a lot of ways, which is fine because of all the bands for Motley Crue's purposes. Because for all of the bands that were influenced by, I always think of them first when you think of bands that were influenced by like the New York Dolls. The punk scene. Kiss was too earlier, but it's that's kind of part of their brand. But the thing with Vince, it's not about vocal ability. It's about, like you said, this strange phenomenon of singing every second or third word and kind of slurring the others. And
Vince live, anyways. Vince Neil at his best reminds me of Axl Rose at his worst. They both do the same thing where they just run back and forth a lot and think that covers for doing the song.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is that always struck me as odd with Axl. How much he runs around, considering the image put forth in the music videos about his sort of central nature in the band. Most of the videos, he's dead center on stage. There's a little bit of side crowd shots in Paradise City and shit like that. But mainly he's dead center. And he's in this realm. He's moving. He's interesting. He's physically doing stuff. But he's not just, running track back and forth, right?
Yeah.
And when he did that live, and I've seen them a couple of times, and I've seen Motley Crue more than that, they both do the kind of same thing where they just spend a lot of time doing crowd running and not enough time singing the songs. And Axl can, at certain times, manages to pace himself or something, or just runs at a slightly slower clip or something. I don't know what it is, just works for him, where he manages to get out all the words 80% of the time. Vince, like after song 2, if not right out of the gate, he's skipping every other word, even when they're important. Like sometimes you see people leave out a conjunction because they know the audience is singing along, so they'll drop the and or the but or the or the those kind of moments because the audience is picking it up and they need to swallow while they're on stage or clear their throat or take a breath or something like that. I've seen there's a couple of times. Like the one that stands out is Tom Kiefer singing Night Songs on one of the shows I saw. He dropped the word ain't, working this job ain't paying the bills, sick and tired of rat race, taking my thrills. Like he dropped every kind of fourth word, and it was, I remember watching it and it was kind of off-putting, but you could tell he was like winded. Or something, from it. And he's a skinny dude by comparison. So Vince, and Vince has a very high voice, but it's all head voice when it works. And the problem with that is you have to keep the pipes clean. You can't have, alcohol and smoking will have its deleterious effects on it, but you also can't have acid reflux. That's the biggest enemy of those kind of singers is acid reflux. Because it's so light what you're singing, how much volume you're actually making is so small. And if you're doing thinner notes that are clean, which is what he's doing, and you're not doing the Axl rasp, if you're not counting on the rasp to cover it, there was a I remember people talking about how Jeff Tate just does not hang out with the band, doesn't talk to people after shows, goes home and is a dud when you're around him, mainly because he can't afford to use his voice anytime randomly, because it's that what you say, those notes are so clean, so fine, and all head voice, then he's got to bounce back and forth. It's like watching him sing, and the new singer as well, that style, Mark Slaughter does that as well. That kind of singing is like, it's so delicate. People don't recognize, how much work that is. And Vince, that's where his voice is. And if he fucks around and drinks or smokes or whatever before a show, you're going to put a little grit on there that's going to bug you as the show goes on and affect your ability to hit notes. And then you're going to, and then you're going to pinch, and you're going to crisscross notes, and it's going to be ugly. And that's always, and that's just because he's lazy about it more than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the shame of it. Whereas Paul, he's over trying is what he is. And he's been trying to find a way to make sure he's giving the best show ever every single time. And it's the exact opposite of the problem these guys have.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's an important distinction to draw.
Yes.
No, go ahead.
I am looking forward to the live shows that will be occurring next year.
Yeah.
Both mid-level bands and all that kind of stuff. And I also, as an artist touring myself, I'm looking forward to my live shows, and I'm looking forward to playing with Nerd Halen and with my band 01 next year, because I really do feel like there's going to be this thing of like, why do we want to stay home? I keep thinking of like 1930s. I was watching this woman who's 93 who has a YouTube channel with like millions of views where she cooks Depression era foods. She cooks, this is what we had for breakfast in the Depression. And so she makes, cookies out of 2 eggs and a pile of sand, and
Is her set like a Hooverville? Like,
it's not a set. It's her like Philly kitchen wherever she lives.
Oh yeah.
With some, hey, Tom Hebert, join us, and look at that, just us, just hanging out. So in the, watching her do these shows, I'm thinking, I think of like what people's response to when you talk about like how people who went through the Depression, how they react to shit now. They save more money. They don't let stuff go to waste. They'd save like fat in a jar. They'd compost, just things like that came from that. They were like, don't let life go to waste, And I think there's something to, after this, much like the Roaring 20s, which happened almost entirely due to the response to the pandemic that they went through.
Yeah.
People wanted to get out and have life and, not be afraid anymore and all that kind of stuff. So it was, it was kind of, that was their psychological response. I have a feeling that there's going to be something like that around live shows again. And mid-level and startup bands are going to have if I'm right about this, will have an easier time launching themselves than bands who've started up in the last 10 years, which really has favored electronic and dance-oriented stuff, where you're not really seeing the artist. You're just going to a club where they play this stuff because it's just, like you would go to a disco, it's disco culture.
Yeah.
And the DJs are just playing recordings of their stuff, acting like they're mixing it or making it right there, which they aren't.
Yeah. I also think that there's going to be some false starts as far as ways to approach this, which is fine. I just think it's going to be a little trial and error. Like,
sure.
I've been seeing talk about, one of the few, you talk about who's done well in all this, like whose stock has gone up. Of course, everybody talks about Amazon. How about the guy that has the old dilapidated drive-in movie theater that nobody wanted to buy? Like, now all of a sudden this guy's got a new lease on life.
Yeah,
but
totally.
So I thought about like that, how to do that and what would a concert at a drive-in theater look. I mean, at first, I'll tell you one thing I like about it is I guarantee you the guy in the car next to me isn't going to be spilling his beer on me. Like, that's nothing. That's a win. But I did think about, okay, if you're in the first couple of rows, that's going to probably be pretty cool. But if you're further back than that, it's not like drive-in theaters were typically, sloped or slanted because you're like a regular movie theater would be. because the screen is so elevated up and large. So unless you're putting the musical act way high up on that screen, you might end up just watching more of the video projection, and that's okay. I mean, that might be okay for the time being to start. But I think there will probably be a few things like that where we end up going, hey, remember for a while, somebody thought this would be a good idea or that would be a good idea. And, and that's okay. I just think it's going to be like the first, you ever watch those first videos of people trying to fly planes before the Wright brothers, and flies, 12 feet and then collapses, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I personally, I genuinely think there will be a resurgence of desire for people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where they will, clearly want, the opportunity. It sounds like there's a pup in there with you.
There is. Yeah, Nala just, she'd had enough of being in the other room and said, I'm going to come in and see what's going on Double Neck Download. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Come here, Nala.
Hi, girl.
You want to say hi? Come here. Get up here. Get up here on the camera so everybody can see you. Come here.
Oh, look at the big girl.
Come here. Nala. Come here. Come right here. Come here. Get up here. Come here. Look. Get up here. Come on. You say hi to Hal.
This is a very secret club, Tom. Oh, beautiful animal.
This is Nala.
Yeah. Hi, Nala. Nala.
Can you see? Can you hear it? Look.
Nala. I think you're on headphones, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
She got a bell on her?
No, her tail is hitting the posts on the table.
Right, and making it ring perfectly. I just feel like I should end a meditation circle.
Yeah. It's a hardwood room, so we got to get echo in here.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I'm going to sign off now, and we will we'll revisit and have another thing. But I want to stand by my prediction, and we will check in a year from now on this one and see how this played out. But I really do think there will be a renewed vigor and desire. Like I said, post-depression, post the, everybody was saving money, post the 1918 pandemic, people were getting out in the streets and gathering in gigantic crowds, that there will be a resurgence of seeing live shows again because you don't want to let life pass you by. And I think there will be, thanks, Tom Hebert. Thanks for joining us. I think there will be a renewed respect. Ding, 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 ding.
Are you hearing that? I thought I had the mic muted.
No, I heard it. Yeah. Renewed respect. I think people are going to have a renewed respect for seeing live shows again. And I look forward to that being the case.
I think that's true. And also, a final thought from me is that I'm also liking seeing all the virtual streams and performances and things that are going on, because I think it's causing a lot of artists, because it's not just younger bands. You're seeing a lot of older art. I mean, there's Sammy Hagar and, the guys in his band doing streams and live performances. And I think that that's going to create a lot of new interest in music. It's going to create a lot of awareness for older artists. And it's causing them to have to learn new technologies and approaches and things like that. So it's much like what we talked about a lot of people recording new music and getting busy with that. I think they're also going to learn the advantages of streaming, and we're all learning it because, this is also, I think, for video streaming, kind of like Facebook. Like before Facebook, it was unusual for someone to have a website. You were the exception. Because Facebook is basically a one-page blog feed website for everybody. Everybody's got one. Now everybody's video streaming with Zoom or whatever. Some of the people that were holdouts socially have now had to do it for their jobs and things like that. So everybody will emerge much more adept at, oh yeah, of course, I know what that thing, that little camera eye is for my computer now, and I'll use it to check out live performances. Sorry for Nala's
never apologize
yeah.
for Nala. No,
She
never.
she was off in her room, but she was like, "All right, well, you guys have been doing this show for the better part of an hour, and that's long enough."
My turn, right? That's right.
Yeah, right.
That's totally cool. All right, my brother. We will talk again soon.
Yeah.
This is the Double Neck download. Don't forget where you get your regular podcast. If you're not just watching it here, if you're listening to this, give us a thumbs up. Go to doubleneckdownload.com. All the links are there. You can contact us, any topics, any people you'd like us to reach out to, PR people. If you want us to talk to your person, come on. Come on, Cletus. Come on. Reach out to us. You're awesome, and we will see you next time.
See you soon, guys.